Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Ashley, thank you for being here and testifying. I want to follow up on some of the questions that Senator Kennedy asked you, and just, you're here testifying on behalf of the DEA. Did the DEA as an agency take a position when this legislation was pending before Congress?
I hate to keep repeating myself. I was not present during those conversations, but it's my understanding, yes, concern was expressed the entire time.
Okay. Your personal knowledge, you're testifying on behalf of an agency.
Yes, sir.
So presumably, somebody at the DEA knows whether the DEA took a position on this piece of legislation.
Yes, sir.
The agency as a whole has a collective memory. If you weren't involved in that, fine, but the agency knows.
Yes, sir.
How would that position have been expressed?
I believe that it was expressed in discussions through the department and initially working with the House and also with the Senate Judiciary committees.
Did the Department of Justice express a position on this legislation?
I believe that, yes, sir.
Did they support this legislation?
In the end, they support the ultimate language. I believe the concern of how the bill would affect how we conduct our investigations was expressed throughout.
I just want to understand. So the Department of Justice supported the legislation in the version that actually passed. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the DEA supported the legislation in the version that actually passed?
Yes, sir.
What advice did the DEA and the Department of Justice give President Obama on whether to sign this legislation?
That conversation would have been through the Department of Justice. I'm not certain what it was, but I know that technical assistance was provided on the final language.
All right. So is the legislation working? Set aside whether DEA and DOJ and the entire U.S. executive branch was supporting the legislation. Set that aside. We're here now. We're a year into it. Is it working, or are there unintended consequences?
We were able to continue to issue ISOs as we have in the past, so it didn't hamstring us from doing that. The concern was manufacturers and distributors, the ability to use it, and we have not executed one since enactment of the legislation, so that remains to be seen, proving that case under the new legislation.
You haven't executed one. Is that a problem? Is that a lack of legal authority? Why haven't you? What are we missing?
Actually, sir, the distributors and manufacturers that we were looking at that were doing the most shipment of drugs had recent actions taken against them, and the other distributors they're a close enough knit community. A deterrent effect kicks in but the larger distributors, the big three we call them, they had recent action taken against them. So since the implementation of the ISO, they're already under memorandum of agreement to be in compliance with the Controlled Substances Act. So it hasn't been warranted so far.
So if I'm understanding you, there hasn't been a factual predicate, there hasn't been a need for it. Is that correct?
There hasn't been a test case, sir. No.
What is not working about this legislation, if anything? This Congress is trying to understand if legislation was enacted that made things worse. We would like to know that, but y'all are on the front lines dealing with it, and we need your expert judgment to help us in assessing that.
So the concern now, prior to the legislation, we were in a preventative mode. We want to stop this distributor from making shipments before there's harm done. So we could identify violations of the Controlled Substance Act solely that the distributor committed. The current legislation requires that we establish a substantial likelihood of immediate death, bodily harm, and abuse. Prior to that, we would only need to establish the increased potential for diversion.
Does the DEA believe this legislation needs to change?
DEA, along with the Department of Justice, supports a change in the legislation, yes.
What change does the DEA support?
Now, so there's where I have to be careful. I'm not an attorney, sir, so I don't want to throw out language, the potential for language that could make it worse. But I'm happy to continue, as we have many times, work with this committee to hammer out language.
I'm going to ask you if the DEA, as an agency, has a position supporting a change in legislation, I would ask that you convey that to me, and I'm sure my colleagues would be interested in writing.
Yes, sir.
The specific language that you believe would work better.
Yes, sir.
We can't understand what you're requesting if the agency doesn't request it clearly and with language attached.
Yes, sir. I will do that.
Thank you, Ms. Ashley.